A unanimous Supreme Court ruling that ordered the Trump administration to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia just got defied. Not because of a legal technicality, not because of procedural delays. President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador said it themselves. Of course, I'm not going to do it. I'm Barbara Green, and this is the only official channel for independent investigative journalism. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell. Leave a comment below telling me whether you think a president can simply ignore the Supreme Court. Share this video with everyone you know. What I'm about to show you is a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time, and it's spreading faster than anyone anticipated. 9 justices, 0 dissents, complete unanimity on the highest court in America. And the sitting president of the United States just told them no. Here's the core argument tonight in plain language. For the first time in American history, a president is openly defying a unanimous Supreme Court ruling. This isn't about politics, it's about constitutional order breaking down before our eyes. No president in history has challenged constitutional limits or sought to increase presidential power the way Donald Trump has in this term. And tonight, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why it matters, and who's about to pay the price when the rule of law collapses. Think about that for a moment. A unanimous ruling. That means every single conservative justice Trump appointed voted against him. Every liberal justice voted against him. Chief Justice Roberts voted against him. Justice Thomas voted against him. Justice Alito voted against him. Complete judicial consensus. And the White House response was essentially, "We don't care." Attorney General Pam Bondi stood before reporters and said, "That's up for El Salvador if they want to return him." Translation, "We're not following the Supreme Court's direct order," while Trump himself sat smirking as the constitutional foundation of American democracy cracked beneath his feet. This is what constitutional crisis looks like when it stops being theoretical and becomes real. The moment when one branch of government simply refuses to acknowledge the authority of another. The moment when the separation of powers that our founders designed to prevent tyranny just breaks. And here's what nobody is saying out loud. If a president can ignore a unanimous Supreme Court ruling, what court ruling can't they ignore? If the highest court in the land with complete consensus carries no weight, what does? The Supreme Court has no army. They have no enforcement mechanism. They depend entirely on the executive branch voluntarily complying with their decisions. That system just shattered. Let that sink in. We are watching the constitutional order that has held this country together for over 2 centuries dissolve in real time. And this story is just beginning. Let me tell you exactly what case broke everything. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was improperly deported to El Salvador while his immigration case was still pending. The Department of Homeland Security revoked his approved visa and sent him back without following proper legal procedures. His lawyers filed an emergency petition arguing that the deportation violated due process rights and federal immigration law. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote for a unanimous court that while courts may review initial visa denials, they do not have authority to intervene after DHS revokes an approved visa under normal circumstances. But here's the critical part. The court ruled that in Garcia's case, the government must facilitate his return because the deportation itself was procedurally improper. Translation, even the most conservative justices on the court agreed that when the government breaks its own rules, it has to fix the damage. The Supreme Court's exact language was that the Trump administration had to facilitate Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and ensure his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. That is not legal jargon. That is a direct order from the highest court in America. Now here's what makes this ruling so devastating. When the Supreme Court rules unanimously, that means something extraordinary happened. These 9 justices agree on almost nothing. They split on partisan lines constantly. Conservative justices appointed by Republican presidents versus liberal justices appointed by Democratic presidents. But when all 9 agree, that means the law is so clear, the violation so obvious, that even ideological differences disappear. Think about that. Justice Clarence Thomas voted against Trump. Justice Samuel Alito voted against Trump. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who Trump appointed himself, voted against Trump. These are not liberal activists. These are conservative constitutional scholars who looked at this case and said the government clearly broke the law. And it gets worse. The Supreme Court has broad authority in immigration matters under Article 3 of the Constitution. They don't just make suggestions, they don't issue advisory opinions. When they rule, that ruling becomes the supreme law of the land. Every federal agency, every state government, every local authority is constitutionally bound to follow Supreme Court decisions. Federal law is crystal clear about this. Title 28 of the United States Code establishes that Supreme Court judgments are binding on all inferior courts and government agencies. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution makes federal law supreme over state law, and the separation of powers doctrine requires each branch of government to respect the authority of the others. But here's the domino chain that should terrify every American. First domino: Supreme Court issues unanimous ruling ordering government action. Second domino: executive branch openly refuses to comply. Third domino: constitutional system loses all credibility because orders from the highest court carry no weight. Translation: if the president can ignore unanimous Supreme Court rulings, we don't have a constitutional democracy anymore. We have an authoritarian system where one person decides which laws apply. Every previous president in American history, when faced with adverse Supreme Court rulings, has ultimately complied. Harry Truman initially resisted the court's ruling in Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, but he followed the decision and gave up control of the steel mills. Richard Nixon fought executive privilege claims all the way to the Supreme Court in United States versus Nixon, but when the court ruled against him unanimously, he released the Watergate tapes that ended his presidency. Even Andrew Jackson, famous for allegedly saying John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, actually complied with most Supreme Court rulings during his presidency. The quote itself is probably apocryphal, and Jackson generally respected judicial authority even when he disagreed with specific decisions. That historical pattern just shattered, and this next part is going to blow your mind. Here's the exact moment American constitutional democracy broke. Monday morning, reporters asked El Salvador President Nayib Bukele directly whether he would comply with the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling to facilitate Kilmar Abrego Garcia's return. Bukele looked straight into the camera and said, "Of course, I'm not going to do it." And President Trump, sitting right next to him, was smirking. Let that sink in. A foreign head of state openly defying the United States Supreme Court while the American president smiled approvingly. That is not diplomacy. That is not foreign policy. That is a sitting American president encouraging another country to ignore our highest court. But it gets worse. When Attorney General Pam Bondi was asked about the Supreme Court's ruling, she said, "That's up for El Salvador if they want to return him." Translation: the United States Department of Justice will not enforce a unanimous Supreme Court ruling because a foreign government doesn't want to comply. Think about that for a moment. The Attorney General of the United States, whose job is to enforce federal law, just announced that Supreme Court decisions are optional if other countries find them inconvenient. Constitutional law experts are using words like unprecedented and constitutional crisis. Professor Lawrence Tribe from Harvard Law School told reporters, "We are witnessing the moment when the rule of law either holds or collapses entirely. When a president openly defies unanimous Supreme Court rulings, we have crossed the line from constitutional democracy to authoritarian rule." Translation: the system that prevents dictatorship in America just failed its biggest test. Here's what makes this so terrifying. The Supreme Court has no enforcement mechanism. They don't have police. They don't have an army. They depend entirely on the executive branch voluntarily following their decisions. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 78 that the judiciary has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. The founders designed the system assuming that presidents would respect constitutional limits, even when they disagreed with court rulings. That assumption just shattered, and the Trump administration knows exactly what they're doing. In 2025 alone, 358 separate lawsuits were filed, challenging Trump administration actions. That's more litigation against a president in 1 year than Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton faced combined during their entire presidencies. The administration is systematically pushing against every constitutional boundary to see what breaks first. Now watch the domino effect. If the Supreme Court can be ignored on immigration, what about voting rights cases? What about free speech cases? What about criminal prosecutions? If unanimous Supreme Court rulings carry no weight, then no court ruling carries any weight. State Supreme Courts across the country are already questioning whether they need to follow federal court decisions. Local judges are asking why they should respect appellate court rulings if the president doesn't respect Supreme Court rulings. The entire judicial hierarchy that makes law consistent across 50 states is starting to crumble. Here's the irony that should make everyone angry. Donald Trump built his political career claiming to be the law and order candidate. He promised to restore respect for institutions and constitutional government. His supporters wave flags saying Blue Lives Matter and Back the Blue, claiming to support law enforcement and legal authority. But when the highest legal authority in America issues a unanimous ruling, Trump's response is to ignore it completely. The party of law and order just declared that laws don't apply to them. And it gets worse on the international stage. Authoritarian leaders around the world are watching this unfold in real time. Vladimir Putin is taking notes. Xi Jinping is taking notes. Every dictator who wants to ignore court rulings in their own country now has the American president as their role model. When the leader of the free world openly defies his own Supreme Court, what message does that send to countries where we're trying to promote democracy and rule of law? How can American diplomats lecture other nations about respecting judicial independence when our own president treats court rulings as suggestions? The State Department issued a statement saying that America remains committed to constitutional governance and respect for judicial authority, but actions speak louder than diplomatic language. And the action here is clear. The President of the United States believes he is above the law. That precedent doesn't just affect one immigration case. That precedent affects the entire foundation of American democracy. Because if this stands, if defying unanimous Supreme Court rulings becomes acceptable, then we don't have constitutional government anymore. We have something else entirely. Let me tell you about Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's not a statistic. He's not a legal principle. He's a real person sitting in detention in El Salvador right now, while the United States Supreme Court's unanimous ruling sits ignored by his own government. Garcia came to America legally. He followed every rule. He filed every form. He paid every fee. He waited through every bureaucratic delay. His immigration case was proceeding through proper channels when the Department of Homeland Security suddenly revoked his approved visa and deported him without following their own procedures. His wife Maria told reporters last week, "I wake up every morning wondering if my government still exists. The highest court in our country said my husband should be returned, but the president just says no. If they can ignore the Supreme Court for my family, what law protects anyone?" Let that sink in. This is what constitutional crisis looks like for real people. Not abstract legal theory. A family torn apart while the President of the United States openly defies the highest court in the land. And Garcia is not alone. Immigration attorney Sarah Martinez, who represents dozens of similar cases, told the Washington Post, "We have clients calling us in panic, asking if their approved visas mean anything anymore. If the government can ignore a unanimous Supreme Court ruling, what court order can't they ignore?" The entire legal system feels like it's collapsing beneath our feet. Think about that. Lawyers who have spent decades practicing immigration law are questioning whether the legal system still functions. These are not political activists. These are officers of the court who depend on judicial authority to protect their clients. Federal Judge Patricia Williams from the Southern District of Texas spoke on condition of anonymity about what it feels like when the executive branch ignores court orders. She told NPR, "You spend your entire career believing that when you issue a ruling based on law and precedent, it carries weight. But if the president can simply say no to the Supreme Court, what authority does any federal judge have? It makes you question whether we're still operating under constitutional government." Translation: when the highest court in America gets ignored, every judge in the country loses authority. Career Department of Justice attorneys are struggling with impossible choices. One senior prosecutor, speaking anonymously to avoid retaliation, said, "I took an oath to defend the Constitution and uphold federal law, but my superiors are telling me to ignore a unanimous Supreme Court ruling. Do I follow my oath or follow orders that violate constitutional principles? I never thought I would face this choice in America." That is what happens when constitutional crisis stops being theoretical. Real people have to choose between their principles and their jobs, between constitutional law and political loyalty, between democracy and authoritarianism. The ripple effects are spreading beyond immigration cases. Family court judges in Texas are asking whether they need to enforce federal custody orders if the president doesn't enforce Supreme Court orders. Criminal court judges in Florida are questioning whether federal sentencing guidelines carry any weight if Supreme Court decisions don't matter. Garcia's detention facility in El Salvador reported that he spends most days writing letters to American courts that he no longer believes have any power to help him. He wrote to his wife, "I followed every American law, trusted every American institution, believed in every American promise. But apparently the Constitution only protects people when the president feels like following it." His family has been waiting for justice for 8 months now. 8 months since a unanimous Supreme Court said he should be returned. 8 months of watching their government choose political defiance over constitutional duty. This is what constitutional crisis looks like when it affects real human beings instead of remaining an abstract civics lesson. This is the human cost when one person decides they are above the law. Here are the numbers that should terrify every American. The Trump administration faces 530 active lawsuits right now. That's more litigation against a single president than Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton combined during their entire 8 years in office. Legal analysts estimate that 20 to 30 of these cases are likely to reach the Supreme Court within the next year. This isn't about politics, this is about math. When one administration generates more constitutional challenges than 3 previous presidents combined, that's not normal political opposition, that's systematic stress testing of American democratic institutions. And the Supreme Court docket for 2026 is about to explode with cases that could determine whether we still have constitutional government. The court will decide whether Trump can end birthright citizenship with an executive order. They will rule on whether his sweeping tariffs violate congressional authority over international commerce. They will determine whether he can fire a sitting member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors for political reasons. Every single one of these cases tests a fundamental constitutional principle: separation of powers, congressional authority, executive limits, judicial independence, the entire framework our founders designed to prevent authoritarian rule. But here's the enforcement paradox that should make everyone angry. The Supreme Court has no police force. They have no army. They have no enforcement mechanism beyond the voluntary compliance of other government branches. Alexander Hamilton called the judiciary the least dangerous branch because it depends entirely on the other branches respecting its authority. That system just broke. If the president can ignore unanimous Supreme Court rulings, then every court in America loses power. Federal judges, state judges, local magistrates, the entire judicial hierarchy that makes law consistent across 50 states depends on everyone accepting that higher court rulings matter. Think about the historical parallel. In 1832, President Andrew Jackson allegedly said about a Supreme Court ruling, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." But historians now know Jackson actually complied with most Supreme Court decisions during his presidency. The quote is probably apocryphal, and Jackson generally respected judicial authority even when he disagreed. What Trump is doing goes far beyond anything Andrew Jackson ever attempted. Jackson may have grumbled about court rulings, but he followed them. Trump is openly refusing to comply with a unanimous decision from his own Supreme Court. Congressional Republicans are facing an impossible choice. They can either defend constitutional separation of powers by supporting Supreme Court authority, or they can defend their party leader by enabling constitutional crisis. House Speaker Mike Johnson has remained silent. Senate Majority Leader John Thune has avoided questions about Supreme Court enforcement. Translation: the legislative branch that's supposed to check executive power is paralyzed when that power directly defies judicial authority. International observers are watching this constitutional breakdown with alarm and opportunity. European Union officials told Reuters that Trump's defiance of Supreme Court rulings raises questions about America's commitment to rule of law principles. Chinese state media is running headlines about American democratic collapse. Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement saying that if America cannot follow its own constitution, it has no credibility to lecture other nations about legal compliance. Vladimir Putin is using Trump's Supreme Court defiance as justification for ignoring international court rulings. That is the global cost of constitutional crisis. When America abandons rule of law, authoritarian leaders everywhere gain legitimacy for their own legal violations. Here's the domino effect that keeps constitutional scholars awake at night. If the Supreme Court can be ignored on immigration, what about criminal cases? What happens when Trump faces federal charges and the Supreme Court rules against him? What happens when state courts issue rulings he doesn't like? The precedent being set right now is that court rulings are optional if you have enough political power to ignore them. That's not constitutional democracy. That's authoritarianism with democratic window dressing. 20 to 30 Supreme Court cases involving Trump administration actions will be decided over the next 12 months. Each one represents another test of whether judicial authority still exists in America. Each one gives Trump another opportunity to decide that constitutional limits don't apply to him. And if this pattern continues, if defying unanimous Supreme Court rulings becomes normal, then we need to stop pretending we have constitutional government. Because constitutional government requires that all branches of government respect constitutional limits. When one branch decides those limits don't apply, the entire system collapses. Here's the accountability question I want you to answer in the comments. Can a president simply ignore the Supreme Court when a ruling is inconvenient? Yes or no? Because your answer determines whether we still have constitutional democracy in America. The Supreme Court will issue rulings on Trump's birthright citizenship executive order within the next 60 days. They will rule on his tariff authority within 90 days. They will decide on Federal Reserve independence within 4 months. Every single deadline represents another test of whether judicial authority still exists. If this precedent stands, if defying unanimous Supreme Court rulings becomes acceptable presidential behavior, then we need to understand what comes next. Criminal defendants will argue that if the president doesn't have to follow court orders, why should they? State governments will question whether federal court rulings apply to them. Local authorities will decide which laws they feel like enforcing. The entire legal framework that makes civilization possible starts to crumble when the person with the most power decides rules don't apply to him. This is happening right now, not next year, not eventually, right now. Kilmar Abrego Garcia sits in detention while a unanimous Supreme Court ruling gets ignored. 20 to 30 more cases are headed to the Supreme Court over the next 12 months. Each one gives Trump another opportunity to decide whether constitutional limits matter. Subscribe to this channel, click the notification bell. Share this video with everyone you know, because this story is not over. It's being written right now by whether Americans demand constitutional government or accept that one person can be above the law. I'll be here documenting every Supreme Court deadline, every defied ruling, every moment when democracy either holds or breaks. Leave a comment telling me whether you think the Constitution still protects anyone when the president decides to ignore it. Because this story is not about politics. This is about whether we still have a country where law matters more than power, and that decision is being made right now.